Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Now let's start the story. Hey guys, remember me? I'm Jason, the guy who managed to put an axe through his own foot during the zombie outbreak. I chuckle softly, the sound fading into the cold silence of the cabin. Yeah, it's been 6 months since we last spoke, and oh boy, do I have a story for you. The fire crackles behind me, its warmth a fragile shield against the chill seeping into the cabin. The wind outside has picked up again, a low, mournful howl weaving through the trees. I tug the blanket tighter around my shoulders, the chair creaking as I shift my weight. When I left this place, I thought I was ready for whatever the world could throw at me. Turns out I was wrong. The closer I got to civilization, or what's left of it, the uglier things became. I lean forward, staring into the open journal on the rough wooden table. Each word feels heavier than the last, dredging up memories I've spent months trying to bury. But this is the only way to understand it all, to get it out. I started running into marauders about a week after leaving the cabin, I write. They'd taken over the highways and main roads, setting up barricades made from burned-out cars and fallen trees. At first glance, they looked like military, uniforms, gear, even patches. But up close, you could see the truth. The patches didn't match. The uniforms were scavenged, and their weapons, they didn't carry them like professionals. They carried them like predators. I sit back, letting the pen rest against the edge of the journal. My eyes drift to the Glock 22 on my hip. It's become an extension of me now, a constant companion in a world where trust is a liability. They weren't just thieves, I continue, speaking to the empty room as much as the page. They were worse. They didn't just take what they wanted, they took people. Good people. They dragged them off to God knows where, and you'd never see them again. Labor camps, slavery, or worse. The cabin creaks as a gust of wind rattles the windows. My hand instinctively drops to the Glock, fingers brushing the cold steel. The paranoia never leaves even here, miles away from the nearest town. Speaking of people, I mutter, my voice filling the otherwise silent room. There was her. The girl I picked up on the first day out of the cabin. She couldn't have been older than 20, thin, scared, and clutching a broken broomstick like it was Excalibur. I don't even know her name. I thought I was helping her. Maybe I was, for a little while. But one night, while I was asleep, she took everything, my supplies, pistol, and boots, and vanished into the darkness. I woke up freezing, starving, and furious, and yet I can't bring myself to hate her. I'd probably have done the same in her shoes. Wherever you are, I say quietly, I hope you found what you needed. I've been back at the cabin for 3, maybe 4 months now, I write. It's hard to tell time anymore. My only calendar is nature. Longer nights, colder mornings, frost clinging to the windows, winter's coming. The thought makes me shiver, and I pull the blanket tighter. Winters up here are brutal. Without electricity or proper insulation, the cabin feels more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The city of Wallowa. I trail off, staring at the page. The words feel too heavy to write, but I force them out. It's a wasteland. Crumbled buildings, burned-out cars, shattered glass. It's like a war zone that never ended. I've been scavenging the outskirts, but there's not much left. Food is scarce, and what's still edible is rotten or buried under debris. I look out the window, my eyes scanning the dark tree line. In the distance, a crow caws, the sound cutting through the silence. Even nature feels different now, more hostile, more desperate. I've had to learn how to hunt, I say, more to myself than to the journal. Never thought I'd see the day, but here we are. Turns out, I'm not bad with a bow. Quiet, efficient, and doesn't draw the infected like gunfire. Outside, the sun dips lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. I glance at the clock on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:17, a relic of a world that no longer exists. I've learned a lot in these months, I write. Not just about surviving, but about people. The good, the bad, and the downright ugly. And trust me, there's a lot of ugly out there. But there's good too. You just have to look harder to find it. The fire crackles again, and I lean forward to toss another log onto the flames. Sparks rise into the air, flickering momentarily before fading into the shadows. 6 months, I say quietly, staring into the fire. 6 months, and I'm still here, still breathing. That's gotta count for something, right? The flames dance, their warmth chasing away the creeping chill. For now, the cabin feels like home again, a fragile sanctuary in a world stripped of meaning. But as the shadows deepen and the night closes in, I can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring. There's no plan, no grand strategy, just me, the cabin, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, I'll make it through another day. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long, uneven shadows across the frosty ground. Jason stood in the clearing behind his cabin, his breath clouding as he scattered handfuls of feed into the small chicken coop he'd built months ago. "Come on, ladies," he said, shaking the tin bucket. The hens clucked and pecked at the ground, their feathers puffed up against the cold. These birds had been a lucky find during a scavenging run, and they'd proven to be one of Jason's best decisions. Eggs weren't much, but they were enough to keep him going some days. The wind whistled through the trees, and Jason pulled his jacket tighter. The chill had settled in early this year, and the frost on the ground warned of the winter to come. He turned his gaze to the old generator tucked behind the cabin, its once bright paint now faded and scratched. It was time to check on it again, he thought. Jason had lived in this cabin for most of his life. His parents had built it when he was a kid, and he inherited it after they passed away years ago. It was a modest place, 2 small bedrooms, a living area, and a kitchen, but it was home. It always had been. He was here when the outbreak started, watching the world fall apart from the safety of these walls. At first, the isolation felt like a curse. However, as the infection spread and chaos consumed the cities, Jason realized the cabin might be the only reason he was still alive. Back inside, Jason grabbed his toolbox and headed to the generator. It had been his lifeline in the early days, keeping the cabin warm and the lights on when the nights were too long and dark. He used it sparingly, rationing the precious fuel he had left. The generator's hum filled the clearing as Jason started it up, the rhythmic chugging reassuring in a way few things were these days. He checked the oil, tightened a few loose bolts, and made a mental note to find more fuel soon. The reserves were running low, again. With the generator running smoothly, Jason allowed himself a moment to breathe. The forest around him was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. It was almost peaceful, almost. Jason's thoughts drifted as he worked, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. He remembered a time before all this, when life was normal, predictable, even boring. A time when the world hadn't fallen apart. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning against the generator. He could almost see it, sitting in the cozy living room of the cabin, a warm cup of coffee in hand, the glow of his computer screen lighting up the space. His favorite YouTube channel, Trent the Traveler, played on the screen. "Man, Trent," Jason murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You always made it look so easy." Trent and his dog, Millie, had been the ultimate duo. Traveling across the US and Canada in a sleek, beautifully converted Dodge van, documenting every moment with an infectious energy that made you want to pack up and hit the road yourself. Jason could still hear Trent's voice, warm and full of life, narrating his latest adventure, fishing in Montana, hiking through the Rockies, or camping by some pristine lake in the middle of nowhere. The van was more than just a vehicle. It was a home on wheels. It had cozy wood paneling, a small but functional kitchen, and a bed tucked into the back. Jason used to marvel at how perfectly designed it was, a dream home for a simpler, freer life. Trent had been Jason's escape from the monotony of everyday life. On bad days, Jason would binge-watch his videos, imagining himself in the wild, chasing sunsets and freedom. One day, Jason used to say to himself, "One day, I'll get a van like that and hit the road too." But that day never came. The world fell apart before he could even try. Jason opened his eyes, blinking against the cold. "I wonder where you are now, Trent," he muttered. "Probably up north, next to a river, living the dream with Millie." He chuckled softly, the sound bittersweet. The truth was, Jason missed Trent's videos, missed the way they could brighten his worst days and give him hope for something better. Now there was only silence, a yawning, suffocating void where the world used to be. Back inside the cabin, Jason switched on his computer, the screens flickering to life with a hum. He clicked through the familiar tabs, his fingers moving out of habit rather than hope. The browser opened, but as always, there was nothing. No connection, no updates. Just the same error message he'd seen 1,000 times before. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his heart heavy. There had been no service for months, but he still checked, every day, without fail. Some part of him couldn't let go of the hope that the internet would come back one day, and with it, a piece of the world he'd lost. With a sigh, Jason powered everything down. The generator hummed softly in the background, a constant reminder of its burning fuel. He flipped the switch, plunging the cabin into silence once more. Gas was too precious to waste on dead screens and broken connections. Jason spent the rest of the day inventorying his supplies, a task that had become a ritual. The shelves in his pantry were sparse. A few cans of soup, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, and some rice he'd found during his last scavenging trip. Not enough for the winter, not even close. He opened a notebook, scribbling down what he needed. Canned goods, rice, flour, salt, fuel, batteries. The essentials. Tomorrow, he'd head out to scavenge again, hitting the small towns on the outskirts of Wallowa. There wasn't much left to find, but he had to try. Jason's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where his pack and rifle waited. The Glock 22 sat on the table, its black metal gleaming in the firelight. He'd cleaned it just yesterday, a task that had become as much a habit as eating or sleeping. The rifle was slung over his chair, its weight a constant presence in his life. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jason stepped outside again. The chickens were roosting, their soft clucking the only sound in the quiet clearing. He checked the coop, ensuring it was secure for the night, before heading to the small shed where he stored his tools and firewood. Winter was coming fast, and Jason knew he wasn't ready. The firewood pile was smaller than he'd like, and the thought of venturing deeper into the forest to chop more made his stomach churn. The infected didn't like the cold, but were always out there. Jason's breath clouded as he stood in the clearing, staring at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to peek through the twilight, their faint light a reminder of how vast and empty the world had become. 6 months, he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. 6 months, and I'm still here. He turned back toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The firelight flickered in the windows, casting a warm glow that beckoned him inside. For now, the cabin was his refuge, his sanctuary. Tomorrow, he'd face the world again. But tonight, he'd let himself rest. Jason settled into his chair by the fireplace, the crackling flames chasing away the chill. He picked up his journal, flipping to a blank page. Day 187, he wrote. Still alive, still here, preparing for winter. Supplies are low. Tomorrow, I'll head out to scavenge. Not much left to find, but I'll try. I always try. He set the journal aside, staring into the fire. Memories of the past tugged at him again, of Trent, of Millie, of a world that no longer existed. But he pushed them aside, focusing on the present. Because in this world, that's all there was. Jason woke to a snow-dusted landscape, the frost clinging to the windows of his cabin. The cold seeped into every corner of the room, even with the fire sputtering in the hearth. Winter was here, and with it, the stark realization that time was up. He couldn't delay any longer. Supplies had to be replenished, and the cabin needed to be fortified before the deep freeze set in. He pulled on his heavy coat, gloves, and boots, the layers barely holding back the chill as he stepped outside. The crunch of snow beneath his boots was sharp in the forest silence. Jason made his way to his truck, a sturdy old beast that had served him well over the past months. He brushed the snow from the windshield and climbed in. After a couple of tries, the engine roared to life, the sound breaking the quiet. A thin plume of exhaust rose into the frigid air as Jason adjusted the heater and checked his supplies. His bat was propped in the passenger seat, the Glock 22 snug against his hip, and his rifle secured in the back. Ammo was scarce, so the bat would have to do it unless things got dicey. The drive into Wallowa was somber. The town, or what was left of it, loomed ahead like a skeletal ruin. Jason had scoured the central part of town weeks ago, picking it clean of anything useful. Now, his focus was on the residential outskirts, rows of abandoned homes that held the promise of supplies and the risk of danger. Jason parked at the edge of the first street, leaving his truck idling. He couldn't afford to let it freeze up in the cold. The houses stretched out before him, their windows dark and their doors ajar or barricaded. He took a deep breath, gripped the bat, and approached the first house. "Anybody home?" Jason called, his voice cutting through the still air. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing faintly. Nothing. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. Jason pushed the door open cautiously, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of decay. He scanned the room, bat at the ready. A low growl sounded from the hallway. Jason tightened his grip as a figure stumbled into view. A zombie, its movements stiff and unnatural, like a mechanical puppet controlled by invisible strings. It lunged at him, but Jason sidestepped, swinging the bat in a clean arc. The crunch of bone was loud in the confined space as the creature crumpled to the floor. "Sorry, buddy," Jason muttered, stepping over the body. "Why?" He moved through the house quickly, searching for anything useful. Most of the cupboards were bare, but he found a few cans of soup and a roll of duct tape. Small victories, he thought, stuffing them into his pack. The next few houses followed a similar pattern. Jason would knock or yell to draw out any zombies, dispatch them with the bat, and then methodically search the rooms. Some houses were empty, while others held grim reminders of what had happened here. Overturned furniture, dried bloodstains, and remnants of lives abandoned in haste. Jason paused in the living room of one house, his breath catching. On the wall was a framed photo of a man, a woman, and two young children smiling brightly. Jason recognized the man, Tim, an old friend from before the outbreak. Jason set the bat down and walked closer, his gloved hand brushing against the frame. He remembered this house, remembered the barbecues and football games they'd watched together. Tim had been the life of the party, always cracking jokes and making everyone feel at home. Jason looked around the room, his chest tightening. Toys were scattered across the floor, a reminder of the kids who had once played here. There were no signs of Tim or his family. There were no bodies, no notes, just silence. "I hope you got out," Jason said quietly, placing the photo on the shelf. He left the house without taking anything. Some places felt too sacred to touch. By midday, Jason had cleared 6 houses, his pack heavier with supplies but his body weary. The cold gnawed at his fingers and toes, even through his gloves and boots. He was about to call it a day when something caught his eye. A trailer parked in the driveway of the last house on the block. The trailer was piled high with cut firewood, the logs stacked neatly and covered with a tarp. Jason's heart leapt. This was precisely what he needed. He approached cautiously, bat in hand, scanning the area for movement. The house attached to the driveway was dark and silent. Jason knocked on the door out of habit, then stepped back, waiting. He moved to the trailer and pulled back the tarp when nothing stirred. The firewood was dry and perfectly cut, ready to burn. Jason quickly unhitched the trailer from the rusty old truck it attached to and hooked it up to his vehicle. As he secured the hitch, a sound behind him made him freeze. A low groan followed by shuffling footsteps. Jason turned to see 2 zombies stumbling out of the house, their movements unnaturally rigid, like marionettes pulled forward by some unseen force. He grabbed his bat and stepped forward, taking the first one down with a swift swing to the head. The second zombie lunged, its fingers clawing at his jacket. Jason shoved it back, swinging the bat and crumpling it to the ground. Breathing heavily, Jason wiped the bat on the snow and glanced around to make sure there weren't any more. Satisfied that the area was clear, he climbed into his truck and started the engine. The drive back to the cabin was slow and cautious. The trailer rattled behind him, the firewood stacked high. Jason watched the road, weaving around abandoned cars and debris. He marked each vehicle he checked, a small red X on the windshield to remind himself it had been looted. The day's weight settled on him when he finally pulled into the clearing around his cabin. Jason unhooked the trailer and began unloading the firewood, stacking it neatly beside the cabin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jason stood back and surveyed his work. The firewood pile was a welcome sight, a small buffer against the harsh winter ahead. He stepped inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeting him. Jason placed his pack on the table and began sorting through the day's haul. Cans of food, batteries, a spare blanket, and other odds and ends. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. As he sat by the fire, sipping a cup of instant coffee, Jason's thoughts drifted back to Tim's house, to the photo of his friend's family. He wondered where they were now, if they were alive, or if they had fallen victim to the same fate as many others. The world was harsh and unforgiving, but Jason clung to the small victories. Today he'd survived, today he'd come home, and tomorrow he'd do it all over again. Jason dozed off in front of the fireplace, his body and mind tired from the day of scavenging. Jason jolted awake, the low guttural sounds still echoing in his mind. His heart raced as he scanned the room, disoriented, sweat beading on his forehead despite the warmth of the fire. The dream had felt so real, cold hands grabbing his arms, legs, and throat, the sound of nails scratching against the wood. He reached for his Glock instinctively, gripping it tightly as he tried to calm his breathing. The fire crackle was the only noise, but then he heard it, scratching, faint but deliberate. Jason froze, listening intently. Was he still dreaming? Slowly, he rose from the chair, his legs stiff and unsteady. He moved to the nearest boarded-up window, peering through one of the small peepholes. Nothing. The snow-covered clearing was undisturbed, bathed in the moon's pale light. He crept to the back door, carefully unlocking it and stepping outside. The cold hit him like a slap, but he ignored it, his senses on high alert. Rifle in hand, Jason rounded the corner of the cabin, scanning the shadows and tree line. Then he saw it, a skinny German shepherd, its fur matted and patchy, sniffing and pawing at the front door. The dog froze when it noticed him, its eyes wide with fear. "Hey there, boy," Jason called softly, lowering his rifle slightly. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The dog didn't move, its ears pinned back as it took a hesitant step away from the door. Jason crouched down, keeping his voice calm. "Come on, buddy. Where did you come from, huh? You all alone out here?" The dog didn't respond, only watching him with wary eyes. Jason scanned the area again, his grip tightening on the rifle. The fresh dusting of snow showed no human tracks, just the faint paw prints of the dog. If this was a trap, it was well hidden. "Smart boy," Jason muttered, standing up and gesturing toward the back of the cabin. "Come on, let's get inside. It's too cold out here." The dog hesitated, but followed cautiously as Jason retreated to the back door. Once inside, Jason secured the door and placed his rifle by the wall, keeping it within reach. The dog lingered near the door, its head low and tail tucked between its legs. Jason grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, poured a water bottle into it, and set it on the floor. "Here you go," he said, returning to give the dog space. The German shepherd approached slowly, tentatively. When it reached the bowl, it lapped the water in frantic gulps, draining it in seconds. "Thirsty, huh?" Jason said, a small smile forming on his face. "You look like you haven't eaten in weeks." He grabbed a piece of elk from an earlier hunt and placed it on a plate, setting it on the floor near the dog. The shepherd sniffed the meat, then devoured it hungrily, its sharp teeth tearing through the flesh. Jason watched in silence, his heart softening. The dog's ribs were visible beneath its thin coat, and its eyes were tired but intelligent. When the meal was finished, the shepherd walked over to Jason, its step still cautious. It stopped at his feet and lowered its head, resting it gently against his boots. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" Jason murmured, crouching down to pet the dog. Its fur was coarse and tangled, but the warmth of its body against his hands was a comfort. Jason checked the dog's neck for a collar but found none. "No tags, huh? Guess you don't belong to anyone." He sat back on the floor, watching the dog curled up near the fire, its head resting on its paws. "So what's your name, boy?" Jason asked, leaning against the wall. "Can't just call you Dog." He began listing names, his tone playful. "How about Duke? Rocky? Buddy?" The dog didn't react, its ears flat and its eyes half closed. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Tough crowd." Then he tried another name. "Max?" The dog's ears perked up and it lifted its head, looking directly at Jason. "Max," Jason said again, his smile widening. "That's it, huh? Max it is." The next few days brought a new sense of life to the cabin. Max was a quick learner, following Jason around as he worked. The dog had a quiet, observant personality, but occasionally showed playful energy that caught Jason off guard. While Jason chopped firewood or checked his traps, Max would explore the clearing, sniffing every tree and patch of ground as if cataloging his new territory. He stayed close, though, constantly glancing back to ensure Jason was within sight. In the evenings, they sat by the fire together. Max would curl up at Jason's feet, his tail wagging faintly whenever Jason spoke to him. "You're not too bad, you know that?" Jason said one night, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, his eyes closing in contentment. Max wasn't just a companion, he was a reminder of what Jason had been missing. The cabin had been a place of survival, but now, with Max around, it felt slightly less empty. One afternoon, while Jason was cleaning his rifle, Max started barking, a sharp, urgent sound that made Jason drop what he was doing. "What is it, boy?" Jason grabbed his rifle and followed Max to the window. The dog stood rigid, his ears forward and tail straight, growling low in his throat. Jason peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Still, he trusted Max's instincts. His heart pounding, he scanned the tree line through his rifle's scope. The snow-covered clearing was undisturbed, and after a few tense moments, Max relaxed, letting out a soft whine. "False alarm?" Jason asked, lowering the rifle. Max wagged his tail and nudged Jason's hand, as if to apologize for the scare. "Good boy," Jason said, ruffling Max's fur. "Better safe than sorry." As the days passed, Jason and Max developed an unspoken understanding. Max would alert Jason to any movement outside, and Jason made sure Max had food and warmth. The dog's presence was a comfort, a steady reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still room for connection. Sitting by the fire one night, Jason looked down at Max, stretched out on the floor, his paws twitching in his sleep. "Guess it's you and me now," Jason said quietly. "Welcome home, Max." This chapter introduces Max as a loyal and endearing companion, giving him a personality that complements Jason's character while adding warmth and hope to the story. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to adjust. The air felt sharper with each passing day, cutting through even the thickest layers Jason could pile on. Snow blanketed the ground in a suffocating silence, and the winds howled through the trees like mournful ghosts. Winter had arrived in full force, and with it, the fragile balance of survival grew more precarious. Jason pulled his jacket tighter as he stood outside, stacking firewood beside the cabin. His breath billowed in the icy air as Max padded beside him, the dog's coat dusted with snow. Max sniffed at the woodpile, occasionally pawing at the ground before glancing up at Jason with curious eyes. "Not much we can do about it, Max," Jason muttered, placing another log on the pile. "Gotta make do with what we've got." The food supplies were dwindling faster than Jason liked. Hunting had been sparse, the game scarce and cautious in the frigid weather. He had been rationing their meals, stretching each scrap as far as he could, but the gnawing hunger was a constant reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. Inside the cabin, the fire blazed brightly, the only source of warmth in the otherwise freezing space. Jason sat at the table, sharpening his hunting knife, while Max lay on the floor by the hearth, his tail thumping lazily against the wood. "You've got it good," Jason said, glancing at the dog. "All you've got to worry about is staying warm and getting fed. Me? I've got to make sure we both make it through this mess." Max gave a soft huff, as if in agreement, before resting his head on his paws. The quiet was interrupted by a faint sound outside. Jason froze, his hand stilling on the knife. Max's ears perked up, and the dog lifted his head, growling low in his throat. "Stay here," Jason said, grabbing his rifle. He opened the door slowly, the cold biting into him as he stepped onto the porch. Snow fell softly, blanketing the clearing, and at first he saw nothing but the unbroken whiteness. Then, movement caught his eye, a figure stumbling through the snow, hunched and shivering. The man was old, his beard white, and his face weathered. He clutched a tattered coat around his thin frame, his steps faltering as he approached. "Help!" the man called weakly, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Jason hesitated, his grip tightening on the rifle. The man didn't appear to be a threat, but Jason knew better than to let his guard down. Max stood at Jason's side, growling softly but not lunging forward. Jason called out, his voice firm. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" The man stopped, swaying slightly. "Name's Ed, just looking for shelter. Can't feel my fingers." Jason stepped off the porch cautiously, keeping the rifle at the ready. Max followed closely, his tail low and his body tense. "Where are you coming from?" Jason asked, his tone clipped. Lost my place weeks ago, Ed said, his breath in ragged puffs. Been wandering since. Found a barn a few days back, but the roof caved in. Need somewhere dry, somewhere warm. Jason scanned the man's face, searching for any hint of deception. There was none, just exhaustion and desperation. Jason considered his options, his mind racing. Bringing Ed into the cabin would be the kind thing to do, but kindness often came at a cost in this world. Supplies were tight, and he couldn't risk losing what little he had left. "There's a house not far from here," Jason said. "It's empty, but it's dry. You'll have a roof over your head and a fire to keep warm." Ed nodded weakly. "That'll do, thank you." Jason gestured toward the truck. "Come on, I'll take you there." The drive to Tim's house was a quiet one. Ed sat in the passenger seat, his hands trembling as he held them near the truck's heater. Max sat in the back, his watchful eyes fixed on the old man. Jason pulled up to the house he had scavenged just days ago. The sight of the familiar place stirred a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. It was the best he could offer. "This is it," Jason said, parking the truck. Ed stared at the house, his expression unreadable. "You're sure it's safe?" Jason nodded. "Cleared it out myself. No zombies, no surprises. There's still some furniture inside. Should be enough to keep you off the floor." Inside, Jason set down his rifle and got to work. The fireplace was cold and full of ash, but it didn't take long to coax a flame into life. Soon, the fire roared, casting warmth and light into the dark room. "You'll need this," Jason said, grabbing an armful of wood from the pile outside. He stacked it neatly next to the hearth, enough to last a few days if Ed rationed it. Ed sat heavily in an old armchair, his hands outstretched toward the fire. "You're a good man," he murmured, his voice trembling. Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rummaged through his pack, pulling out his last few cans of chili and 2 bottles of water. He set them on the table next to Ed. "This'll get you through the next couple of days," Jason said. Ed's eyes widened, his gratitude clear in his expression. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." Jason shrugged, grabbing his rifle and heading toward the door. "Just stay warm. That's all I care about." The drive back to the cabin was silent. Max sat in the passenger seat, resting his head on Jason's lap. The warmth of the dog's presence was comforting, but Jason's mind churned with doubts. Had he done the right thing? Leaving Ed in that house felt like abandoning him, but bringing him into the cabin felt impossible. Survival meant making hard choices, but the weight of those choices never seemed to get lighter. Back at the cabin, Jason unloaded his gear and stoked the fire, the familiar routine grounding him. Max settled by the hearth, watching Jason with those perceptive eyes. "You think I made the right call, boy?" Jason asked, sitting down heavily in his chair. Max whined softly, resting his head on Jason's knee. Jason sighed, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I hope so." As the fire crackled and the snow fell outside, Jason leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The old man's face lingered in his mind, reminding him of the world's harshness and his fragile humanity. Tomorrow, he would face another day. But tonight, he let the warmth of the fire and the steady presence of Max ease the burden of his doubts, if only for a little while. The snow fell relentlessly, coating the landscape in an unforgiving white blanket. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was surrounded by a silence so profound that it pressed down on Jason like a weight. Every sound, Max's soft breathing, the crackle of the fire, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, felt amplified in the cold stillness. Jason knew that winter wasn't just coming, it was here, and surviving it would take every ounce of his effort and every bit of luck he had left. The morning light crept through the boarded-up windows, casting faint patterns on the floor. Jason stirred in his chair, stretching out the stiffness in his muscles. Max was already awake, sitting by the door with his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "Another day, huh?" Jason muttered, rubbing his eyes. Max barked softly, his tail thumping against the door. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, let's get to it." The first task was hunting. Jason slung his rifle over his shoulder, grabbed a small pack, and set out with Max trotting at his side. The snow was deep and powdery, slowing their progress, but Jason pressed on. Hunting in winter was never easy, but they needed meat to last through the months ahead. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and small animals replaced by the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Max moved ahead, his nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to sniff at a patch of snow. After hours of trudging, Jason spotted tracks, deer, fresh and heading deeper into the woods. His heart quickened as he motioned for Max to stay close. The dog obeyed, lowering his head as they crept through the trees. Jason froze when he saw it, a large buck grazing on a patch of exposed grass near a frozen stream. Its impressive antlers were a sign of its age and strength. Jason steadied his rifle, taking slow, deliberate breaths to calm himself. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The buck staggered, then collapsed into the snow. Jason approached cautiously, his rifle ready, but the animal didn't move. "Good work, Max," Jason said, glancing at the dog, who barked once, his tail wagging. Field dressing the deer was messy, but Jason worked quickly, his hands numb despite the gloves. He packed as much meat as he could into his pack, knowing it would fill the small freezer he'd rigged to run off the generator. Jason felt a rare sense of triumph as they hauled the meat back to the cabin. It wouldn't last forever, but for now, they had enough. Later that afternoon, Jason tried his luck at fishing. He and Max made their way to a nearby stream, its surface partially frozen but still flowing in places. Jason chipped away at the ice, creating a small opening for his line. The hours dragged on, and the biting cold seeped through his jacket and gloves. Max sat on the bank, his head resting on his paws, watching Jason with patient eyes. "Nothing," Jason muttered, reeling in the empty line. He packed up his gear with a sigh. Fishing had always been hit or miss in the winter, but it still stung to come back empty-handed. Max perked up as Jason stood, the dog's energy seemingly undeterred by the failed trip. "Guess it's all on the deer this week," Jason said, scratching behind Max's ears. "Come on, let's head back." Back at the cabin, the preparations continued. Jason carefully stored the deer meat, wrapping it tightly and placing it in the freezer. The generator hummed softly in the background, keeping the freezer running long enough at times to keep it frozen. It was sat outside, so the winter temperatures helped keep it cool. He melted fresh snowfall in a large pot over the fire, pouring the water into bottles for storage. It was a slow process, but Jason had learned to appreciate the rhythm of these tasks. Max lay near the fire, chewing on a bone Jason had saved. The dog seemed content, his tail wagging occasionally as he gnawed at his prize. "You've got it easy," Jason said, glancing at Max with a smirk. "All the food and none of the work." Max let out a playful bark, as if in agreement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason leaned against the workbench near the window, staring at the snow-covered clearing. His thoughts drifted to Ed. The old man had seemed harmless enough, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he might have been a trap. Every crack of a branch or distant rustle in the woods put him on edge. His hand often hovered near the Glock on his hip, and Max's occasional growls didn't help ease his nerves. But more than fear, Jason felt a nagging sense of responsibility. He couldn't stop wondering if Ed was still at Tim's house, if the old man was okay, or if he'd succumbed to the cold or something worse. "Tomorrow," Jason said aloud, his voice breaking the quiet. Max lifted his head, his ears perking up. "We'll go check on him tomorrow," Jason continued. "Make sure he's still kicking. And make sure he didn't lead anyone back here." Max wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out in what Jason liked to think was encouragement. Jason grabbed another log for the fire, feeding the flames as he settled into his chair. The cabin was warm, the air filled with the comforting crackle of burning wood. "Another day down, Max," Jason murmured, glancing at the dog. "Let's hope tomorrow's just as quiet." As the firelight flickered across the walls and the snow continued to fall outside, Jason allowed himself a moment of calm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but he and Max were safe tonight. And for now, that was enough. The morning was bitterly cold, the kind that seeped into Jason's bones no matter how many layers he wore. Max trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, leaving a trail of paw prints in the fresh snow. The truck's engine roared to life as Jason loaded it with supplies for the trip. A few tools, extra firewood, and a small bundle of food. "We're just checking on him, Max," Jason said, as much to himself as to the dog. "In and out, no complications." Max barked once, his tail wagging as he jumped into the passenger seat. Jason slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly as he stared at the snow-covered path ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was a bad idea, but the nagging thought of Ed's frailty kept pulling at him. The drive to Tim's house was quiet except for the rumble of the truck and the occasional bark from Max. Snow crunched beneath the tires as Jason navigated the winding forest roads. His breath fogged up the windows despite the heater working overtime. When the house finally came into view, Jason's heart sank. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the windows were fogged over, hinting at the cold within. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a sign of life, but the place looked as fragile as Ed himself. Jason parked and stepped out, scanning the area. Max stayed close, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. Jason knocked on the door. "Ed, you in there?" For a moment there was no answer. Then the door creaked open and Ed appeared, bundled in layers of clothing, his beard even more unkempt than before. "Jason," Ed said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Jason nodded, stepping inside. The house was as cold as it looked, though a small fire crackled weakly in the fireplace. The furniture was sparse, and the air carried a damp, musty smell. "You're still here," Jason said, his eyes scanning the room. Ed chuckled, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Where else would I go?" The two men sat near the fire, Max lying at Jason's feet, his eyes scanning the room as if he didn't trust it. Jason handed Ed a small bundle, 2 cans of food and a bottle of water. "Figured you might need these," Jason said. Ed nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he took the offering. "You didn't have to do that. I'm getting by." Jason glanced around. The roof leaked in places, the walls were thin, and the fire barely warmed the room. "Doesn't look like you're getting by too well." Ed laughed softly, shaking his head. "I've seen worse. This place is a palace compared to some of the holes I've crawled through." Jason leaned back, his rifle resting across his lap. "How'd you make it this far, Ed?" The old man's eyes took on a faraway look, his voice quiet but firm. "You learn to adapt. You don't dwell on what you've lost. You focus on what you've got left. The world's harsh now, sure, but it always had its edges. Just sharper ones now." Jason nodded, his mind drifting to the days before the outbreak, when life was predictable but often taken for granted. "Doesn't mean you stop fighting," Ed continued, "even if it's just for one more day." Jason stood after a while, his gaze falling on the sagging roof. "Your shelter needs work. If you want this place to last through winter, you're going to need more than a fire." Ed raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "Let me patch up the roof," Jason said. "I've got tools in the truck. Won't be perfect, but it'll hold." Ed hesitated, then nodded. "You'd do that for an old man like me?" Jason smirked. "Guess I would." The two men spent the next few hours working on the house. Jason climbed onto the roof, clearing snow and securing makeshift patches with tarps and boards he had scavenged. Max stayed inside with Ed, who occasionally came out to pass Jason tools or hold a ladder steady. By the time they finished, the roof no longer sagged, and the worst of the leaks were sealed. "Should hold for a while," Jason said, brushing snow off his gloves. Ed clapped him on the shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "You've got a good heart, kid. Don't let this world take it from you." Jason didn't respond right away, staring out at the snow-covered forest. "This world doesn't leave much room for hearts like that." Ed smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but every once in a while, it surprises you." As Jason prepared to leave, Ed stood in the doorway, the firelight casting long shadows behind him. "You've done more for me than I deserve," Ed said. "You ever need a place to rest, you're welcome here." Jason nodded, his voice quiet. "Take care of yourself, Ed. Don't waste what I gave you." "Don't worry about me," Ed replied. "I'm tougher than I look." The drive back to the cabin was somber. Max rested his head on Jason's lap, his eyes closed, but Jason couldn't stop thinking about Ed's words. The old man had faced the same horrors Jason had, yet he still clung to hope, still found meaning in helping others. Back at the cabin, Jason unloaded his gear and stoked the fire, the warmth filling the small space. Max lay by the hearth, chewing on a stick Jason had brought in from outside. Jason sat in his chair, staring into the flames. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or just the reminder that even in a world as broken as this one, there were still moments worth holding on to. The days blurred into weeks as winter tightened its icy grip on the forest. Jason's cabin had transformed into a fortress, a testament to his determination to survive. He worked tirelessly to fortify the structure and surrounding property with traps and barriers to ward off infected and marauders. Wooden spikes lined the perimeter. Tripwire alarms strung with empty cans clattered in the wind, and shallow trenches filled with sharp stakes were hidden beneath the snow. His efforts weren't just for security. They were acts of defiance against a world that seemed intent on taking everything from him. Max followed him faithfully, sniffing the ground and alerting Jason to even the faintest rustle in the trees. The dog's keen senses had proven invaluable, making Jason feel like he was never truly alone. Inside the cabin, Jason had achieved a rhythm of survival. Hunting trips provided meat he salted and stored in his makeshift freezer powered by the generator. Firewood gathered and split during the short daylight hours, stacked high next to the cabin. Melting fresh snowfall for clean water was an endless task, but Jason had grown accustomed to the steady pace of his days. Max thrived in the cold, bounding through snowdrifts like a puppy. His energy was a stark contrast to Jason's stoic demeanor. Watching Max often brought a rare smile to Jason's face. "You've got the easy job," Jason said one afternoon as Max dropped a stick at his feet, tail wagging. Max barked, his tongue lolling out as if laughing at the comment. As the days grew colder, Jason decided to check on Ed. He couldn't shake the memory of the frail old man in the dilapidated house, nor could he ignore the gnawing guilt of having left him behind. Jason loaded the truck with a bundle of firewood, tools, and food. Max hopped into the passenger seat, eager as always for the journey. The drive to Tim's house was quiet, and the snow-covered streets were familiar. When the house came into view, Jason slowed the truck, scanning the area for signs of trouble. The roof remained under its makeshift patches, and faint smoke curled from the chimney. He parked a short distance away and approached the house cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder and Max at his side. Jason knocked on the door. "Ed?" "It's Jason." After a pause, the door creaked open and Ed appeared. He looked as frail as before, but there was a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there the last time. "Well, I'll be," Ed said with a grin. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Jason nodded, stepping inside with Max. The house was warmer now, though it still carried the damp smell of old wood and snow. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, and Ed gestured for Jason to sit. Jason handed Ed a small bundle of supplies as they sat by the fire, 2 cans of food and a bottle of water. "Figured you could use these," Jason said. Ed accepted them with trembling hands. "You didn't have to do this. I've been getting by." Jason raised an eyebrow, glancing at the patched roof and thin walls. "Barely." Ed chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're not wrong, but I've made it this far, haven't I?" They talked for a while, their conversation meandering between survival tips and memories of the old world. Ed shared stories of his youth, of simpler times when survival didn't mean fighting the cold or the infected. "You're lucky, you know," Ed said, nodding toward Max. "Having something by your side makes the world a little less lonely." Jason glanced at Max, stretched out by the fire, his head resting on his paws. "Yeah, I am." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Jason tensed immediately, his hand moving to his Glock. Max growled low, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Ed moved cautiously to open it, peeking outside before pulling it open a crack. A young man stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, his face gaunt and hollow. "Don't mean to bother you," the man said quickly. "I'm just passing through. Saw the smoke and thought, maybe you could spare some water or food." Jason stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Where are you headed?" "South," the man replied, his voice shaking. "Trying to find somewhere warmer, maybe safer." Jason studied him for a long moment before reaching into his pack. He handed the man a bottle of water and a can of food. "This is all I can spare." The young man accepted them with shaking hands. "Thank you, I won't forget this." Jason watched as the man disappeared down the street between the houses toward the main highway, his footsteps muffled by the snow. "You think he'll make it?" Ed asked quietly. Jason shook his head. "Hard to say, but he's got a better chance now than he did before." Back at the cabin, Jason felt a strange sense of clarity. The encounter with the young man reminded him of the outside world, its dangers and desperation. Still, it also reaffirmed his resolve to stay. The cabin was his sanctuary, where he could protect himself and Max from whatever lay beyond the tree line. He spent the following days fine-tuning his defenses, adding more spikes to the perimeter and reinforcing the cabin's doors and windows. Max was his constant shadow, patrolling the property and sniffing any signs of intruders. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Jason sat by the fire with Max curled up at his feet. The flames cast flickering shadows across the walls, their warmth contrasting the icy world beyond the cabin. "You and me, Max," Jason said softly, scratching the dog behind the ears. "We've got this." Max wagged his tail, letting out a contented sigh as he rested his head on Jason's knee. Outside, the cold wind howled through the trees, but inside, the cabin was warm and secure. Jason stared into the flames, his resolve steady and his mind at peace. For now, he had everything he needed, and that felt like enough for the first time in a long while.